The Arctic ice cap is the largest expanse of sea ice on Earth. It's a huge frozen ocean of 5.5 million square miles that surrounds the North Pole. The windiest place on Earth is Antarctica, the South Pole, a land embedded in ice. Temperatures here can plunge to minus 128 degrees. These two desolate regions boast some of the most unforgiving weather on Earth. Polar weather. A great sea of turning, grinding ice surrounds the North Pole. But there are a few gaps in the ice where those brave enough can explore this frigid twilight world. It's a killer environment. Unprotected, this diver would die in minutes. Early polar explorers battled through the ice in wooden ships. They suffered appalling hardship and many lost their lives. In the great race to be the first to conquer the pole, the enemy was always the weather. A lethal combination of winds and temperatures no one could imagine before their ships were crushed by the ice. Even today, this heaving, frozen ocean can trap and sink a reinforced, steel-plated ship.
Мы сегодня, мы здесь, на северном полюсе, и должны хорошо отработать это событие вместе. Поздравляю! Up to date, all of you are of the North Pole.
These American tourists were transported here on a Russian ship. In 1991, it was the first icebreaker to cut a path through the Arctic ice all the way to the North Pole. Ice along the route can be over 9 feet thick, but the nuclear-powered Russian ships rammed their way through by brute force. Each summer, the tourists turn this extreme landscape into their playground. Seawater freezes at a lower temperature than fresh water. These hardy individuals are braving water that's only 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Extending south from the Arctic Ocean is the vast island of Greenland. Here, the ice is piled up 2 miles thick. Massive glaciers squeeze and flow between its mountains like gigantic frozen tongues. Where they reach the ocean, they shed icebergs from their tips. Each year, the Greenland glaciers give birth to as many as 15,000 icebergs. Some of them are so large their tips stand over 500 feet. But a much larger portion of an iceberg lurks unseen beneath the waves. There is up to 7 times more ice under the water. And when these floating islands blunder into the North Atlantic shipping lanes, disaster can strike. In 1912, British shipbuilders launched a great ocean liner. They believed the Titanic was unsinkable. But on her maiden voyage, tragedy struck. On a foggy night, her steel hull was ripped open by an iceberg. There weren't enough lifeboats for all the passengers. Distraught relatives learned that of over 2,200 passengers and crew, only 705 had been rescued. All the rest had drowned. As a result of that terrible tragedy, the U.S. Coast Guard set up an international ice patrol that still scours the North Atlantic for rogue icebergs. Beginning every January, they fly out over the Atlantic shipping lane to assess the danger and then relay their warnings back to any ship in jeopardy.
6 miles off 3 o'clock on the aircraft. Can't see for the underpass. Very close limits requested descent.
This threat is so great that there have even been attempts to try and melt the iceberg. They've even tried to lasso them in a vain attempt to tow them out of the way. Other crazy-sounding ideas have included dropping bombs on them or painting them black so they melt in the sun. As winter approaches, fresh sea ice extends hundreds of miles out from the North Pole. Trapped icebergs become a headache for the icebreakers that struggle to keep the sea lanes open for as long as possible. Just 100 miles from the North Magnetic Pole on Canada's icebound Little Cornwallis Island, miners dig all year for valuable ores of zinc and lead. This is one community that ships must reach. It's the last ice-breaking voyage of the year. This is the only cargo ship in the world that's both powerful and strong enough to venture into the fabled Northwest Passage as late as November. This journey, across 400 miles of frozen ocean, will take 4 days. In case the cargo ship gets stuck, the Canadian Coast Guard has sent along an escort icebreaker. On the Coast Guard's radar, they watch for icebergs. They also keep a constant visual check on the sea ice they're heading into. The last thing they want is to get both ships stuck, but they allow the cargo ship to go first through the ice. Her bow is made up of special 12-inch thick steel that rides up on top of the ice, which cracks under the weight of the ship. The worst hazard is multi-year ice, layers of ice that don't melt in the summer months. Hitting this ice is like trying to break through concrete. To help reduce the risk of getting stuck, the cargo ship has also hired a small plane equipped with synthetic aperture radar, an imaging system that can detect not only where the ice is, but just how old and hard it has become. The Coast Guard captain can see the thickest multi-year ice as white, rounded areas on his radar screen.
I think it's the strongest concrete in my opinion.
An area with sharp, angular corners is younger, softer ice, but even that may hide fragments of hard ice. A few days earlier, after they'd been trapped by multi-year ice, they sent a robot camera down to check the damage. A propeller blade has been bent out of shape, and the ship is now limping along. But there is a way out. They must get back into young soft ice, which shows up as black on the radar screen. The Coast Guard icebreaker has a helicopter on board and carries an ice specialist who can check the condition of the ice ahead. The cargo ship has become stuck in heavy ice, and because it's so long and thin, it can't turn.
sir. What's your heading there, please?
The ice specialist searches to find the best way out of the thick ice.
Roger that. Once you've pointed westward, there's just about 3 miles of multi-year ice to go through, and then it breaks wide open into young and thirsty.
The Coast Guard icebreaker is much more maneuverable. By cutting a path alongside the cargo ship, it opens up a channel of clear water that the thick ice can slide sideways into. This releases the pressure in the ice surrounding the trapped cargo ship. The maneuver is successful and it's able to move again. Soon, the ice will be too thick for either of these ships. After this journey is completed, it will be 6 months before they can venture back up here again. The winter freeze can extend beyond the poles. Expose the relatively warm sea to chill polar air, and this is what happens. You get sea smoke, a haze of quickly crystallized water vapor. The very cold air can sometimes reach a long way farther south. This is North Dakota.
When the temperature is around 35, 40 below, take a glass of hot water, throw it up in the air, and watch it crystallize and freeze before it hits the ground.
As the Earth spins, the air masses break up into separate, swirling bands of weather. The boundary between the two northernmost bands is marked by the jet stream, a high-altitude current of air that circles the globe. It often swings south across the Rocky Mountains. But in January 1996, the freezing polar air spills much farther down.
Waves in the atmosphere really amplifying to create that storm to our south that'll be coming up the coast.
We could even experience blizzard-type conditions during the day tomorrow. Here we are in Washington. It is right on our southwestern doorstep. That's all moving this way. And what we call the jet stream feeding through Texas and out through the Gulf of Mexico is really a big moisture source. Just feeding this storm. The heavy bands of snow will be right over Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia.
Cold polar air brought with it one of the worst winter storms the east coast of America had ever seen. It dumped 31 inches of snow in just 30 hours on some of the most populous areas. It brought businesses and transportation to a grinding halt. In the northeastern states alone, 60 lost their lives in the bitter polar weather. The polar ice sheets of the Arctic and Antarctic cover 1/7 of the Earth's surface. Five and a half million square miles of floating Arctic ice surround the North Pole. At the South Pole, Antarctica is a whole continent in deep freeze. Bigger than the United States and Mexico combined, it spreads and doubles its size each winter. Because they're at the ends of the Earth, both polar zones have long, dark, freezing winters and summers when the sun never sets. As the Earth makes its annual journey around the sun, the tilt of its axis exposes each pole in turn to constant daylight for 6 months. But even during these long summers, the sun's rays only skim the ice caps, delivering hardly any warmth. The air at the poles is very dry. At minus 40 Fahrenheit, it can hold only 1/10 of the water it could at normal temperature. But there's something else, almost invisible, that's falling all the time. Shine a light through the polar night, and this is what you see. It's called diamond dust. 6,000 feet up in the mountains of Antarctica, this diamond dust has been captured by a polar meteorologist. There's not enough water in the cold polar air to create a complete snowflake, but there is just enough to make these tiny flat hexagons of ice. They materialize from thin air in a cloudless sky and create a halo as they glint against the sunlight. If there's any wind, its fine dust rises up like a blizzard under your feet. Over millions of years, enough diamond dust has accumulated in Antarctica to create an ice cap nearly 3 miles thick. Ice collected from the surface is made up of separate crystals. But deeper down, samples taken from ice cores reveal that it's been compressed into a brittle solid. This iceberg is made of diamond dust that was once buried deep inside the southern ice cap. It reveals that the true color of pure ice is blue. Because icebergs melt mostly from beneath, they become unstable and keel over. It all makes for a bizarre diving board. The forbidding ice shelves of Antarctica rise 100 feet straight out of the sea. This is supported below the water by a further 400 feet of ice. Although it may be fraying at the edges, this floating mass of ice covers 300,000 square miles. That's twice as big as Japan. But in the last 30 years, the ice shelves around Antarctica have been getting smaller. They are disappearing at a rate of more than 1% every 10 years. When the sun returns each spring, the winter's relatively thin sea ice breaks up and blows offshore. In the summer, cracks develop along and into the ice shelves as vast icebergs drift away. The biggest icebergs in the world are found in the South Atlantic. Some of them are so large, up to 150 miles across, that they can be tracked by satellites for years before they melt. To study life in these extreme conditions, and to help find out whether we're under threat from global warming or from another ice age, Antarctica is populated by a few thousand scientists, scattered around the continent in a few remote bases. Many of the bases are almost impossible to reach except by air. Antarctica is immensely high. Mountains soar to over 13,000 feet, as tall as the Rockies, but only their peaks project through the thick mantle of ice that fills in the deep valleys. There's so much ice that the average height of Antarctica is 7,500 feet, 3 times higher than any other continent. 90% of the world's ice is here, 2/3 of the world's fresh water. Melt all the ice on Antarctica, and world sea levels would rise 200 feet. The mass of ice is so heavy that in places it has pushed the underlying bedrock down below sea level. Antarctica is the coldest place on Earth, with an average winter temperature of minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also the windiest place on the planet. Cold air pours down the valleys like a never-ending avalanche. It howls unchecked across the ice for thousands of miles. This land of savage extremes was finally conquered by explorers only this century. In 1910, in a converted whaling ship, British naval captain Robert Falcon Scott set out on his attempt to reach the South Pole. Scott's plan was to transport food and supplies to depots along his route. He pioneered the use of tractors, and when they broke down, he turned to Siberian ponies. On their return from the depots, his support teams used the wind to push them across the ice cap. But all too often they succumbed to the extreme cold and suffered horrendous frostbite. But Scott had a rival, the famous Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. The race for the pole was on. Amundsen had a different approach. His team used dogs, first for transport, but later as food. Amundsen reached the South Pole ahead of Scott on the 14th of December, 1911. A month later, when Scott's team of 5 men reached the pole, they found it was already marked by the Norwegian flag. They had lost the race. Scott's dispirited group now had to face a grueling haul back across the ice. Naval Petty Officer Evans was the first to die in the appalling cold. The remaining 4 struggled on, unbelievably dragging 35 pounds of geological specimens. Trapped in their tent by a raging storm, Captain Oates' frostbite had turned to gangrene. He tried to save his colleagues and walked out into the storm to die. His last immortal words were, "I am just going outside and may be some time." Scott and his other 2 men perished from cold and hunger just 11 miles from a food depot. Ironically, Scott's supplies are still perfectly preserved by the dry, cold Antarctic air. Nearly a century later, they are still edible. Amundsen made it safely back to his ship and returned to Norway as a national hero. He carved his name in history. He had proved that it was possible to reach the South Pole and survive. The ends of the earth are our last remaining regions of true unspoiled wilderness. Perhaps that's why there'll always be more who seek to find their souls and pit their stamina against the extremes of polar weather.